When Lyra and Lena Petrova arrived at the prestigious, overwhelmingly white halls of Crestwood Preparatory Academy, they braced for a challenge. But nothing could have prepared them for what truly awaited. From the very first moment they passed, through the ornate iron gates, Corbin Prescott and his entitled circle of tormentors made it their personal crusade to shatter their spirits. The sisters weathered every cutting remark, every calculated shove, and every venomous slur hurled their way. But when the torment escalated to a physical assault, the twins were left with absolutely no other path. What the bullies failed to comprehend was that Lyra and Lena were highly skilled black belts, molded by a father who ingrained in them the unwavering principle of never bowing to the poison of hatred. The aggressors operated under the delusion that they were preying on defenseless targets. They could not have been more profoundly mistaken. Before we proceed, please share where in the world you're joining us from and be sure to subscribe, because the tale we have for you tomorrow is one you absolutely cannot afford to miss. The sun cast its rays across the sprawling campus of Crestwood Preparatory Academy, bathing the immaculate lawns and imposing brick structures in a brilliant but unsparing light that seemed to watch over the students clustering in small exclusive groups. Every detail of the institution whispered of inherited wealth and deep-rooted traditions. From the flawlessly manicured hedges to the gleaming stone pathways, it was as if the school had been designed not merely for education, but to perpetually remind all who walked its grounds of their precise station in life. Lyra and Lena Petrova, moving in perfect unison, felt that very reminder settle upon their shoulders like a heavy shroud long before they even ascended the main steps. Their uniforms were impeccable, their posture was flawlessly erect, and their expressions were masks of serene composure. Yet, beneath that placid surface, they could sense the immense weight of each scrutinizing glance that trailed their every move, every hushed word that was exchanged between the students they glided past. They were accustomed to stares. They were familiar with whispers, but this felt different, sharper, colder. It wasn't simple curiosity. They could always discern the difference. This was the sort of attention that arrived with a verdict already rendered, with a line etched in stone before they had been given a single opportunity to utter a word. It wasn't just because they were new arrivals, nor was it solely because they were identical twins. It was because they were black, and in this place, that distinction made them stand out more starkly than anything else. Their father, Mikhail Petrova, had cautioned them that it might be this way. He had never presented a sugar-coated version of the world to them. He had conditioned them to anticipate moments precisely like this. He taught them to carry themselves with an unshakable strength and profound pride, regardless of the challenges they confronted. He ensured they possessed the ability to defend themselves if the need ever arose, not just with words, but with a level of skill and control that few others their age could claim. Still, despite all his teachings, despite the years of disciplined preparation, entering this institution felt like deliberately walking into the heart of a storm. They could see gathering from miles off, but were powerless to circumvent. "Well, look at that," a boy's voice declared, pitched just loud enough for them to hear, devoid of any pretense of subtlety. He was propped against a grand pillar near the school's entrance. A self-satisfied smirk stretched across his features as his companion snickered beside him. "Twins," another boy chimed in with a sneer as if the very word were an epithet. "Didn't know they offered a 2-for-1 deal?" Lyra's eyes darted toward them, noticing the way they puffed out their chests as if they held the deed to the very ground they occupied. She felt the hot sting of anger flare in her chest, but swiftly suppressed it. Her father's voice resonated in her mind, calm and unwavering. "They crave a reaction. Do not grant them one." Lena's hand tightened on the strap of her backpack, her knuckles turning pale against the dark fabric. But just like her sister, she maintained a smooth, unreadable expression. The connection between them was a force stronger than spoken language, And she knew Lyra felt the same inferno she did, smoldering just beneath the surface, waiting. They had no need for speech to understand each other. They had confronted enough adversity together to move as a single entity, to think as one mind. They pressed onward without altering their pace, their gazes fixed on the doors ahead, ignoring us. The searing heat of the stairs burning into their backs like sunlight focused through a magnifying glass. The further they ventured into the courtyard, the more explicit the message became. This place had not been constructed for them. The lustrous floors and towering windows, the sparkling trophy cases and proud banners suspended from the walls. All of it felt like a stage meticulously set for a play in which they were never intended to have a speaking part. But still, they walked on. "Ignore them," Lena murmured under her breath, her voice low yet firm. It was more of a reminder than a piece of advice. She didn't glance at her sister as she spoke, confident that Lyra would comprehend without the need. "I see them," Lyra responded, her tone quiet, yet carrying a sharp undertone. "But I will not give them the satisfaction." They reached the massive, heavy doors of the main building, which opened with a soft, hydraulic hiss that felt unnervingly smooth for what lay on the other side. As they crossed the threshold, the chill of the air conditioning washed over their skin, but it did nothing to cool the fire that was building within them. The students already congregated in the hallway pivoted to watch, their conversation ceasing as every eye followed the twins down the corridor. Some faces showed curiosity, others displayed open disdain, and a few revealed a flicker of something far worse. Amusement, as if they were eagerly awaiting the moment the new girls would stumble and give them all a reason to laugh. Lyra's gaze swept the hall, interpreting it like a territorial map, marked with unseen borders. She noted how the bullies congregated in tight packs near the lockers. She saw how the girls whispered behind their manicured nails, casting sideways glances filled with quiet venom. Every detail was absorbed. Every look felt like a challenge awaiting a response. They knew this was merely the beginning. The looks, the whispers, the sharp-edged words, spoken just loudly enough to sting, but softly enough to be denied if confronted. All of it was just the prelude to something that would escalate and escalate until it could no longer be brushed aside. But they were ready. They had faced worse than this. They had trained for tempests exactly like this one. Though the sky above Crestwood Preparatory Academy appeared serene and clear, Lyra and Lena could feel the pressure mounting in the atmosphere. The promise of thunder was waiting just over the horizon. They would not be the ones to strike first. Their father had taught them better than that. But if the storm came to them, they would not run. And when it finally arrived, it would be met with something far more powerful than it ever anticipated. The initial days at Crestwood Preparatory passed precisely as Lyra and Lena had foreseen. But that knowledge did little to lighten the burden they had to carry. From the moment they entered their first classroom, it was made abundantly clear that every eye was on them, not with a sense of welcome or curiosity, but with a cold, silent judgment. The classroom itself was tidy and luminous, with sunlight streaming across immaculate desks and reflecting off the polished floors, but no amount of brightness could conceal the way the students and even some of the instructors treated them as if they were interlopers. Teachers would call out their names without glancing up, their voices monotone, their focus already shifting away as if the twins were nothing more than a check mark on the attendance register. In the corridors, the throngs of students seemed to shift just enough to obstruct their path, compelling them to step aside or slow their pace, all while feigning that it was merely an accident. It was not. They knew it, and the students surrounding them knew it as well. But Lyra and Lena refused to provide the reaction their tormentors craved. They held their heads high, moved with unwavering purpose, and did not allow the palpable tension to force them into a defensive position. Even as the stares intensified and the whispers grew sharper, they pushed through each day, resolute, and silent. It did not take long for Corbin Prescott to reveal himself. He was not difficult to identify. He carried himself as if he owned the institution, walking with a nonchalant swagger that stemmed from knowing the rules were never truly meant for him. His dark hair was impeccably coiffed, as if he had just stepped off the set of a photo shoot. And he wore his uniform as if it were a costume, his tie loosened and his shirt untucked just enough to broadcast how little he cared. "Hey," Corbin shouted one morning as the twins were crossing the courtyard toward their lockers. His voice was loud, self-assured, designed to command attention. His friends clustered around him, already chuckling, as if they didn't even need to hear the punchline to know it would be effective. "Did you two get lost on your way to the service entrance?" he inquired, his words ringing out clear and sharp in the open space. His friends erupted in laughter, far too loud for such a feeble insult. But they were not laughing at the joke itself. They were laughing at its target. Lena kept her eyes fixed forward, her expression placid, her steps unwavering. She denied them the satisfaction of even a backward glance. Lyra's gaze flickered to Corbin for a fleeting moment, sharp and resolute, but she too did not break her stride. She saw the smirk plastered on his face, saw his friends nudging one another, feeding off the attention, and though her chest constricted with anger, she kept it contained beneath the surface. They both did, but Corbin was not done. "I guess they don't understand English," he called out, his voice louder this time, ensuring everyone in the vicinity could hear. "Maybe we should try speaking their language." "What is it, ghetto slang?" The laughter that ensued was more vicious this time. It rippled through the crowd, drawing in more students, even those who hadn't been paying attention before. Now they were watching, waiting, some amused, some curious, none of them concerned enough to intervene. Lyra's jaw clenched, her teeth grinding together, but she took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying herself. She could feel Lena nearby, her presence a solid anchor, keeping her from being swept away by the storm Corbin was attempting to conjure. They continued moving. In the days that followed, the situation only deteriorated. Corbin's friends, Finn and Liam, escalated their campaign of harassment. They turned it into a game to bump into the twins in the hallways, sending their books tumbling to the floor with insincere apologies and smug expressions that confirmed they knew exactly what they were doing. "Didn't realize they were letting the custodial staff take classes now," Finn muttered one afternoon as he brushed past, his voice just loud enough for the nearby students to overhear. "Maybe they're just here for some on-the-job training," Liam added, with a smirk. "The school's got to keep these floors spotless somehow." The twins said nothing. They collected their books, straightened their spines, and moved on. But with every shove, with every insult, the pressure intensified a little more, like a weight being slowly added, testing how long they could bear it before it finally crushed them. What made it more difficult was the profound silence from everyone else. No teachers intervened, no students spoke out. Even those who didn't participate in the bullying simply looked away, feigning ignorance. The teachers kept their gazes fixed on their papers or their screens, unwilling to become involved, unwilling to acknowledge that this seemingly perfect school had something ugly festering just beneath its polished facade. At home, their father recognized the signs, even though they tried to conceal them. Mikhail Petrova had taught them how to fight, how to defend themselves with skill and control. But he had also taught them to anticipate trouble, to recognize the subtle signals that forewarned of greater storms on the horizon. Over dinner, he observed his daughters intently, reading the tension in their jaws and the weariness in their eyes. He didn't question them directly, didn't pressure them to speak before they were ready. But when they finally confided in him, he listened without interruption. "You remember what I taught you," Mikhail said that night, his voice calm but devoid of any softness. "Control is power. They want to get under your skin. Don't let them." Lyra nodded, her mouth set in a firm line. Lena mirrored her sister's resolve, though her eyes held a flicker of frustration that was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. "They're pushing," Lyra said, consistently and seriously. "Harder every day." "They will," Mikhail replied without a hint of hesitation. "They think you'll break. They want you to. And if they don't stop?" Lena asked, her voice just as steady. her meaning unmistakable. Mikhail's eyes met theirs, and in that gaze there was no hesitation, no doubt. Then they'll discover that you are not the ones who break. His words hung in the air like a quiet promise, one the twins carried with them into the next day and the days that followed, letting it rest just beneath the surface of their calm expressions. They walked through the halls of Crestwood Preparatory with their heads held high, knowing it was not a question of if things would escalate, but when, and that moment was approaching rapidly. The days blurred into one another, each one feeling colder and more hostile than the one before. It was as if the very walls of Crestwood Preparatory had begun to constrict around Lyra and Lena, tightening just enough to remind them that this place was never intended for them, and every passing hour felt like another trial of their endurance. They had maintained their dignity through the stares and the whispers, through the cheap taunts and the forced laughter of students who had long ago learned that cruelty was rewarded here, not condemned. But beneath their composed exteriors, they could feel the pressure mounting, steady and relentless, like storm clouds gathering before a deluge. It was Corbin, naturally, who decided that words and petty shoves were no longer sufficient. He had always craved a larger audience, always yearned to see how far he could push before something finally snapped. And now that he sensed the fissures forming, he wasted no time in orchestrating something cruel enough to capture the attention of the entire school, something designed to humiliate the twins in a way they could never just ignore, no matter how strong their outward facade. The plan was not intricate because it didn't need to be. Cruelty never is, not when it is fueled by arrogance and a crowd eager to participate. It began in the morning when Lyra and Lena arrived to discover their lockers desecrated with vile, hateful words, scrawled across the metal in thick, dripping black paint. The slurs were brazen, shameless, left there for everyone to witness. Red markers had been used to sketch ugly, cartoonish caricatures with exaggerated features intended to mock them. The images were twisted and dehumanizing. Crumpled pieces of paper had been jammed through the locker vents, all of them filled with more insults, each one more venomous than the last. As if the bullies had competed to see who could write the most depraved thing. As they stood there, shoulders squared, faces tight with controlled fury, the hallway around them erupted in laughter, sharp and merciless, with students pausing to point, to capture photos on their phones, to spread the moment like a contagion. Some laughed openly, loud and uninhibited, while others covered their mouths and feigned to hide their amusement. But it made no difference. The twins saw it all, felt every jeer like a needle piercing their skin. Corbin leaned against a nearby locker, arms crossed, observing the scene unfold with a wide grin stretched across his face, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Finn and Liam flanked him, both of them looking thoroughly pleased with themselves, their smug satisfaction evident in every line of their posture. "Figured we'd give you some decorations," Corbin called out, his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear, dripping with mock concern. "Thought it might help you feel more at home." The crowd roared with laughter, the sound reverberating through the hallway like a wave crashing against the shore, relentless and deafening. And for a fleeting moment, even the teachers who happened to pass by hesitated, their eyes lingering for just a second before they swiftly averted their gaze, pretending not to see, pretending it wasn't their responsibility. Lena's hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she struggled to keep her breathing even, her chest constricting with an anger she fought to contain. She could feel her sister beside her, could sense Lyra's rage burning just beneath the surface, held in check only by an immense effort of will. They had tolerated the names. They had endured the shoves. But this was different. This was public, deliberate, a spectacle designed to strip them of their dignity in front of the entire school. And as much as they tried to remain grounded, the weight of it pressed down harder than anything they had faced before. Their father's words echoed in their minds, steady and clear, instructing them to maintain their control, to let their discipline be their guide. But as the laughter continued to swell, and Corbin stepped forward with a slow, derisive clap, they both felt that line growing perilously thin, that fragile boundary between patience and action. "You should say thank you," Corbin sneered, standing closer now, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the surrounding noise. "It takes a lot of effort to make you two feel like you belong." The crowd hung on his every word, their eyes shifting between him and the twins, waiting, hungry for a reaction, for even the slightest crack in their composure. Lyra's eyes locked onto Corbin's, her stare hard and unblinking. And though she said nothing, the message in her gaze was as clear as daylight. Lena, standing just as resolutely, felt the same fire surging in her chest, her pulse quickening as she drew in a slow, deep breath, steadying herself against the rising tide of fury. They would not give him the reaction he desired, not yet. But neither of them could pretend this would simply pass. They both knew that something had shifted in that moment, something sharp and irrevocable. This wasn't just another insult to be ignored. This wasn't something they could brush aside like the whispers in the hallway or the sneers from across the classroom. This was a line that had been crossed, a challenge thrown down at their feet in front of the entire school. As they cleaned their lockers later, wiping away the paint with coarse paper towels provided by a janitor who avoided their eyes and remained silent, Lyra's voice shattered the silence between them, low and certain, carrying a weight that had been accumulating for far too long. "No more," she said, her tone quiet, but as unyielding as stone. Lena didn't need to ask what she meant. She felt the same sentiment burning inside her, the same final crack running through the patience they had fought so hard to maintain. She nodded once, sharp and decisive. "No more," she agreed. The decision was not born of anger alone. It sprang from a deeper place, from the understanding that survival was not always sufficient, that there were moments when standing still meant sacrificing pieces of yourself that you could never reclaim. The moment was coming. They could feel it as clearly as the air they breathed. The next time Corbin and his crew stepped forward, they would not walk away. They would fight. And they would fight just as they had been taught from the very beginning. The atmosphere at Crestwood Preparatory had not improved since the cruel prank. If anything, it had grown heavier, like an unseen weight hanging in the air that everyone could feel. A palpable tension stretched taut over the courtyard as students congregated in their usual spots, speaking in slightly lower tones, casting a few more glances toward the paths they all knew the twins would soon walk. Lyra and Lena, side by side as always, felt every eye on them, every whisper that swirled around them like smoke too dense to dissipate. But they maintained their steady pace, their heads held high, their eyes fixed forward, yet keenly aware of what awaited them just around the next corner. Corbin Prescott was already there, leaning against a sun-drenched stone wall with an expression that was a perfect blend of boredom and cruelty, as if this confrontation was less a decision and more a foregone conclusion. Finn and Liam stood on either side of him, their stances relaxed but their eyes sharp, waiting for their cue, like predators watching their prey walk into a trap. "There they are," Corbin announced, his voice loud enough to capture the attention of every nearby student. The sound of his voice shot across the courtyard like a signal flare, drawing a wider circle of spectators who made no effort to conceal their curiosity. "Thought you two might have taken the hint and stayed home today." Lyra's gaze, sharp and unblinking, found him instantly. She didn't pause in her stride, didn't flinch at his words, but there was no mistaking the way her eyes pinned him in place, steady and cold. "If that's what you were hoping," she answered smoothly, her tone even and clear enough for everyone to hear, "then you're even more pathetic than I imagined." The crowd let out a low murmur, a ripple of surprise moving through the students as they registered the sharp edge in her voice. Corbin's smirk faltered at the corners just for a moment, revealing a flash of irritation beneath. "You've got a lot of nerve," Corbin snapped, pushing himself off the wall and taking a step closer, closing the distance between them with the casual arrogance of someone who had never expected to be challenged. "Talking like that, acting like you belong here." Lena adjusted her stance, squaring her shoulders, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of every insult they had swallowed, every cruel prank they had silently endured until this moment. "We do belong here," she stated firmly, her eyes locked on Corbin without a hint of hesitation. "More than you ever will. You strut around like you own this place, but deep down you know the truth. Without your little posse, You're just another coward hiding behind cheap jokes and weak friends." Her words struck a deeper chord than she could have anticipated, piercing the shallow armor Corbin wore like a mask. The crowd stirred more loudly this time. Students exchanged glances, sensing the dynamic shifting, feeling the ground beneath this confrontation begin to tremble. Corbin's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he closed the remaining gap between them. He stood so close now that Lyra could see the flicker of uncertainty behind his glare, though he quickly masked it with rage. "Say that again," he challenged, his voice tight and brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. "You heard her the first time," Lyra replied calmly, her gaze never wavering. "You just don't like the truth when it's spoken to your face." Corbin's chest heaved as he fought to maintain his bravado, but the cracks were visible to anyone who looked. He turned his glare to the crowd, feeding off their attention, needing it to restore his confidence. "You think you're tough? You think you can stand there and run your mouths without consequences?" "We don't think," Lena said, her tone sharpening just enough to cut through the surrounding noise. "We know." That was the final push Corbin needed to abandon words entirely. His hand shot out without warning, slamming hard into Lyra's shoulder, forcing her to step back from the sudden impact, though she caught her balance easily. Her feet planted firmly on the ground as if rooted there. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. Students drew in their breath as the scene tipped from tense standoff to open aggression. Liam, seizing the opportunity, stepped toward Lena, swatting her books from her arms with a cruel grin, sending pages scattering across the pavement in a chaotic mess that mirrored the prank they had suffered days before. Finn followed, shoving hard into Lena's shoulder, his voice dripping with mockery. "What now? Gonna run home to Daddy?" That was the line, crossed in broad daylight, bold and undeniable. Lyra's eyes burned into Corbin's, her voice calm, but packed with the fire that had been building beneath her ribs for far too long. "No," she said, her breath steady, her words loud enough for all to hear. "We're done running." Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her movement fluid and controlled, and planted her palm against Corbin's chest with a sharp, practiced force that sent him stumbling backward, his eyes wide with surprise as the air was knocked out of him. At her side, Lena moved just as smoothly, dropping low and sweeping Liam's legs out from under him with precision, sending him sprawling to the ground with a heavy thud that instantly silenced his laughter. The courtyard erupted with noise, students shouting, stepping back to form a wide circle around the fight. Their faces were a mixture of shock and excitement as the twins seized full control of the moment. Corbin recovered quickly, but his usual arrogant grin was gone, replaced by pure frustration, as he rushed at Lyra, swinging clumsily. But she saw it coming a mile away, slipping under his swing and driving her fist into his stomach with tight, controlled power. Liam tried to scramble up, but Lena was already there, catching his shoulder and twisting him back down to the pavement. Her movements were sharp and certain, every response shaped by years of training that flowed through her muscles like a second nature. Finn lunged toward her wild and desperate, but Lena sidestepped cleanly, catching his arm as he charged past and flipping him down hard beside his friend, leaving both of them tangled and gasping for air. Corbin, clutching his side, staggered back toward Lyra with a snarl, but she met him with a clean strike under his chin, snapping his head back and forcing him to stumble away, his balance failing as he tried to recover. The twins didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't second-guess the choice they had made. Their father's lessons, drilled into them over countless hours of practice, guided their every move. Every block, every counter, every strike. They were not here to perform for the crowd. They were not here to prove anything to anyone watching. They were here because the line had been crossed, and they were ready. The courtyard had become their arena, and as the fight unfolded with escalating intensity, it became clear to everyone watching that Lyra and Lena were not the victims in this story. They were the reckoning. The courtyard, which had started the day filled with lazy morning chatter and aimless footsteps, now throbbed with an energy so sharp and alive it felt as if every stone beneath their feet had begun to hum. The circle of students had expanded, their voices rising in a mix of shock and exhilaration as Lyra and Lena moved like a storm finally unleashed. Their bodies worked in perfect harmony, every strike and counter-landing with a precision born not of wild anger, but of years of disciplined, patient training. Corbin, forced back by the swift, punishing blows Lyra delivered, tried to compose himself, but fear was now creeping into his eyes, clear and unmistakable beneath the flush of his skin and the sweat beading along his hairline. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, protected by his numbers and his status. But none of that shielded him now. Here, stripped of his usual sneering advantage, he stood face to face with someone who would not cower and would not yield. "You thought we'd just take it," Lyra said. Her breathing controlled, her voice steady, even as she dodged another wild swing and answered with a sharp elbow to Corbin's ribs that made him grunt and stagger sideways. "You thought you could keep pushing until we broke." Her words cut as deeply as her strikes, and Corbin, still gasping for air, found himself struggling not only against her fists, but against the truth in her voice, loud enough for everyone watching to hear and feel down to their bones. Liam, having scrambled to his feet, charged at Lena with a frustrated snarl, but she met him head-on, slipping beneath his swing and driving her palm into his sternum with enough force to send him crashing backward, his body folding over itself as he hit the ground hard, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. "You picked the wrong fight," Lena added, her tone as sharp as steel as she watched Liam writhe on the ground before her, her eyes never leaving him as she took a single, measured step closer, making it clear she would not give him the chance to rise again so easily. Finn, desperate to turn the tide, grabbed a splintered piece of wood from the ground, something that had broken loose from a bench, gripping it in both hands as he rushed toward Lena with reckless force. But she saw him coming, as if in slow motion, her senses honed by adrenaline and discipline, her body already moving to intercept. She sidestepped his charge with smooth precision, her hand snapping out to catch his wrist in a firm, unbreakable grip, twisting sharply to disarm him and send the makeshift weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. In the same motion she spun, driving her elbow into the side of his face and sending him crashing to his knees, dazed and defeated. "Cheap shots won't save you now," she said, her words low but clear, carrying across the circle of watching students who had fallen into a breathless silence, their earlier amusement replaced with something closer to awe and fear. Corbin, furious and embarrassed, lunged at Lyra once more, his fists swinging wild and sloppy, driven by panic rather than skill. But Lyra was already a step ahead, weaving under his attack and catching his wrist in a tight grip, twisting it sharply as she stepped into him and drove her knee into his stomach with brutal force. His breath exploded from his lungs in a choked sound as he collapsed to the ground, clutching his ribs. "You've had every chance to walk away," Lyra said firmly, her voice directed not just at Corbin, but at every single person watching, carrying the weight of everything she and her sister had endured up to this point. "Nay, but you kept coming." She let go of his wrist, allowing him to drop fully to the pavement, his body folding over itself as he struggled to breathe, his face contorted with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Lena stood beside her sister now, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The two of them side by side once more, just as they had been when they walked into this school, only now the ground beneath their feet felt different, as if they had claimed it for themselves through sheer force of will. The crowd around them, once eager for spectacle, now stood in uneasy silence, the realization settling heavily over them that this was no ordinary fight, no simple exchange of blows between schoolyard rivals. This was something deeper, something final, a storm that had been brewing for far too long and had finally broken free. "Maybe now you'll learn," Lena said, her voice cutting through the thick, charged air, "that we're not the ones you can push around." As if driven by stubborn pride alone, Liam tried once more to rise. But Lena was there before he could fully lift himself, planting her foot firmly on his chest and pressing him back down to the ground with undeniable authority. He grunted in frustration, trapped beneath the weight of his own arrogance and her unwavering strength. "Stay down," she warned him, not as a threat, but as a fact, as unshakable as the ground beneath them. Lyra's eyes swept the courtyard, meeting the gaze of every student brave enough to hold it, her expression steady and unyielding. She didn't need to speak the words aloud because they were written clearly across her face. This ends here, and it ends now. But even as the twins stood victorious over the bullies who had tormented them for weeks, they knew this was not the true end of the battle. They could feel it in the way the crowd shifted uncomfortably, in the way teachers had yet to arrive, in the way whispers were already starting to rise, filled with twisted versions of what had just happened. They knew there would be consequences, that victory came with its own cost. But they did not regret their choice, not for a single moment. Because for the first time since they had stepped onto this campus, they had made it clear to everyone watching that they were not to be underestimated, not to be toyed with, not to be humiliated without facing the price. The twins stood tall, their breath steady, their eyes unblinking as they watched the defeated boys writhe on the ground. The fight might have ended for now, but the storm had only just begun. The aftermath of the fight did not descend into chaos, as one might have anticipated, but rather into a strange, stretched silence that seemed to pull at the corners of every moment, drawing out the weight of what had just transpired until it felt heavy enough to press down on every person who had witnessed it. Even as the bullies lay groaning on the pavement, clutching bruised ribs and nursing their wounded pride, the crowd that had once cheered for their cruelty now stood frozen, their earlier hunger for spectacle replaced by a cautious, almost guilty quiet. No teacher had arrived during the fight. Not a single adult had stepped in to stop what had unfolded in plain sight. But now, as though summoned by the heavy air left behind, they began to trickle onto the scene, their expressions tight with confusion and concern, though none of them could feign true surprise. Deep down, they had all seen this coming, or at least they had sensed the inevitability of something breaking beneath the surface of the polished school walls. And now that it had, they could no longer pretend ignorance. "Enough," came the sharp voice of Mr. Davies. The vice principal, as he pushed through the circle of students, his eyes scanning the scene with a look that landed somewhere between outrage and relief that he had arrived only after the violence had ended. His gaze swept from the injured boys sprawled across the courtyard to the twins standing tall at the center of it all, their breathing controlled, their posture strong, their faces set with an unflinching calm that made it impossible to pretend they were anything other than the victors. "What is going on here?" Davies demanded, though the question hung in the air more as a formality than a genuine inquiry, because it was clear from the scene before him exactly what had unfolded. Before Lyra or Lena could answer, Corbin coughed painfully and forced himself to speak through gritted teeth. They attacked us," he gasped, his voice thick with desperation and fear, but also with the familiar entitlement of someone who believed he could still control the narrative if he spoke first. "We didn't do anything. They just went crazy." The crowd shifted, uneasy, their silence beginning to crack under the weight of the lie. Some students glanced away, unwilling to meet the eyes of the twins or the adults now gathering, while others stared at Corbin with uncertainty, as if unsure whether to follow his lead or to finally acknowledge what they had seen with their own eyes. Lyra's jaw tightened, but she held her composure, her father's voice echoing in her mind, steady and unyielding. "Control is power. Speak only when it matters." She met Davies's gaze directly, her eyes clear and sharp, and said in a firm, even tone, "They've been targeting us since we arrived. Today they pushed it too far. We defended ourselves, nothing more." Davies' expression flickered, a brief moment of discomfort crossing his features before he masked it behind the tight professionalism that Crestwood Preparatory demanded from its staff. "We'll sort this out inside," he said, though there was no real promise in his words, no assurance of fairness. "All of you, come with me." The twins did not protest. They exchanged a quiet look between them, a glance filled with unspoken understanding, and fell into step behind Davies as he led the small group away from the courtyard, leaving behind the scattered crowd of students whose excitement had curdled into unease. Inside the administrative offices, the walls felt closer, the air cooler, but none of it dulled the fire burning beneath the twins' calm exterior. They sat side by side in the stiff chairs outside the headmaster's office, their hands resting on their knees, their eyes fixed ahead as Corbin, Finn, and Liam exaggerated their injuries to anyone willing to listen, casting themselves as victims in a story they had twisted beyond recognition. Soon enough, their father arrived, his steps measured, his face composed, though beneath his quiet exterior lay a storm just as fierce as the one that had driven his daughters to defend themselves. Mikhail Petrova entered the office with the steady confidence of a man who had seen far worse than this and had come prepared for every possibility. His eyes moved to his daughters first, checking them not just for injury but for steadiness of spirit, and when they met his gaze, strong and unbroken, a flicker of pride passed between them. He turned then to the headmaster, a man named Albright, whose suit was as crisp as his expression was pinched, as though he had been forced to step away from something far more important than the well-being of his students. "We will be conducting a full investigation," Albright said, his tone clipped, his hands folded neatly in front of him on the polished desk. "But in the meantime, I'm afraid both of your daughters will be suspended until we can review the facts." Mikhail's voice, when it came, was calm, but carried the weight of stone. "My daughters were defending themselves. That much is clear. But I expected as much from this place." Albright's eyes narrowed at the quiet accusation in Mikhail's words, but he said nothing to deny it, offering only a thin, tight-lipped nod. Corbin's parents arrived not long after, and the air in the room thickened at once. Eleanor Prescott swept into the office like she owned it, her sharp heels clicking against the floor, her eyes burning with fury, masked behind a thin veil of practiced concern. Her husband Garrett followed close behind, his broad frame stiff with anger, his jaw set tight as he shot a glare toward Mikhail and the twins. "This is unacceptable," Eleanor snapped before anyone could speak. "Our son has been assaulted. And you're telling me these girls, these violent girls, are simply being suspended? They should be expelled, arrested." Her voice rose with each word, and though Albright attempted to soothe her with vague promises of further action, it was clear Eleanor Prescott would not be satisfied until the twins were punished beyond reason. Mikhail's gaze never left her, his eyes steady and unreadable. But his daughters could feel the tension in him, not wild or uncontrolled, but the same controlled force he had taught them to carry. He watched her rage burn like dry kindling, feeding itself on lies and arrogance, and he let her speak her fury until her words ran thin. "This isn't over," Eleanor hissed finally, her eyes narrowing to sharp points as she turned her glare fully on Mikhail, as if daring him to respond. "No," Mikhail replied evenly, his voice low and calm. "It's not." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, not as a threat spoken in haste, but as a promise forged in certainty. As the twins rose from their chairs, their suspension papers handed to them with cold efficiency, they held their heads high, their posture unbroken, their eyes clear. The fight in the courtyard had ended, but a new fight had begun, one that would not be settled with fists alone. And as they stepped out of the office, their father walking between them, they understood with perfect clarity that whatever came next, they would face it together. The house stood quiet beneath the late afternoon sky, the soft hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the breeze offering a calm that felt almost too still, as if the storm that had started in the halls of Crestwood Preparatory had chased them home, but for a brief moment lingered just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break through. Inside, the air was heavier than usual, not with fear or regret, but with the weight of understanding that what had unfolded at school was not the end of the trouble. They had known it would follow them. They had known the Prescotts would not let it rest. Mikhail sat at the kitchen table, his posture relaxed but never careless, his eyes fixed on the open window that overlooked the quiet street, as if he could already see what was coming long before it arrived. His daughters sat across from him. The three of them gathered not in silence but in shared readiness, their bond thicker than blood, reinforced by everything they had endured and everything they had fought for that day. "You knew they'd come here," Lyra said, her voice steady, not asking a question but stating a fact they all understood without needing to say it out loud. Her father gave a single, small nod, his eyes still watching the street, his mind already walking the steps ahead of him. "People like them," Mikhail replied, his tone calm, his words even. "They don't accept losses quietly. They tell themselves they're entitled to win, no matter the truth. And when they lose, they bring the fight to your doorstep, thinking they'll find you unprepared." Lena's gaze flicked toward the window, her hands resting flat on the table, her fingers loose but ready, her mind turning over her father's words with the same precision she applied to every move she had made in the courtyard. "They think we're finished because we walked away," she said, her tone low but sharp. "But they've never understood what strength really looks like." Before Mikhail could answer, the sound of tires crunching against gravel carried through the air, clear and sharp as a warning bell. They heard the car doors slam next, heavy and angry, followed by the unmistakable stomp of expensive shoes against pavement, a rhythm of entitlement and rage, drawing closer to their front door with every step. "They're here," Lyra said quietly, though the words were unnecessary. There was no mistaking it now. Mikhail rose from his chair in a single, fluid motion, his presence filling the room not with tension, but with solid, grounded certainty. "Stay behind me," he told his daughters, not because he feared what was coming, but because he wanted them to see how a battle was fought when it crossed the threshold of their home. He wanted them to see that strength was not always measured in fists alone, but in the way you stood your ground when the world tried to shove you back. Before the doorbell could ring, before the knock could fall, Mikhail opened the door himself, stepping out onto the porch with the quiet authority of a man who had faced down storms far greater than the one standing before him now. Eleanor Prescott's face was twisted in a mask of fury, barely held together by the thin thread of social civility, her eyes burning beneath perfectly styled hair and expensive sunglasses perched on her head like a crown of false superiority. Garrett Prescott stood beside her, his broad frame stiff with barely contained anger, his jaw tight as his fists flexed at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out like cords stretched too tight. "You think you can get away with this?" Eleanor spat, not bothering with any form of greeting, her words sharp and fast as she stepped closer to Mikhail, her heels clicking hard against the concrete. "You think you can lay your hands on our son, and there won't be consequences?" Mikhail's expression remained unchanged, his gaze steady and unwavering as he met her fury with the calm of a mountain against the wind. "Your son attacked my daughters," he replied, his voice low, but carrying enough strength to fill the space between them completely. "They defended themselves. That's the truth, whether you choose to accept it or not." "Don't you dare play the victim here," Garrett snapped, his voice rough, almost trembling with rage as he took a half-step forward. His posture aggressive, his fists still clenching and unclenching, as if itching for an excuse to strike. "Your girls are animals, just like you, and you've got the nerve to act like you're innocent." The words hung in the air like a foul stench, drawing a cold stillness over the moment. But Mikhail did not rise to the bait. He let the insult sit between them, let it expose more about the man in front of him than any argument could have, and then he answered, not with fury, but with absolute clarity. "You've already made up your mind about who we are," Mikhail said, his tone smooth as stone. "But that doesn't change the facts. You raised a bully, and today he found out what happens when bullies cross the wrong line." Eleanor's face twisted deeper in anger, her mouth opening to spit another insult. But before she could speak, her husband stepped past her, too far gone in his own rage to hold himself back any longer. "You think you can talk down to us in our own town?" Garrett growled, his voice rising as he swung a wild, heavy fist at Mikhail, his face flushed with fury, his eyes wide with a blind certainty that force would win where words had failed. But Mikhail was already moving, already turning his body with practiced ease, his hand rising to catch Garrett's wrist, mid-swing, the force of the blow arrested completely by the strength in Mikhail's steady grip. Garrett's eyes went wide with surprise as Mikhail twisted his arm just enough to throw him off balance, guiding him to stumble sideways before releasing him without wasting a drop of energy. "You've made your choice," Mikhail said evenly, his eyes hard as iron. "Now you'll live with the consequences." But Garrett, too angry and too foolish to see reason, charged again. this time with both hands raised in a clumsy attempt to wrestle Mikhail down, as if brute strength could overpower years of discipline and skill. Eleanor, shrieking something unintelligible, tried to follow, her hands clawing at Mikhail's arm, her fury a storm of wild, uncontrolled rage. Mikhail moved with clean precision, stepping back just enough to draw both of them forward, using their momentum against them. He caught Garrett's arm again, pulled him off balance, and sent him sprawling onto the porch floor with a thud that rattled the wooden boards. Eleanor swung at him wildly, but Mikhail caught her wrist just as smoothly, twisting her arm behind her back with careful practiced control that left her trapped, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. "You came to my home," Mikhail said quietly, his voice carrying not just power, but finality. "You thought you'd bring fear into this house. But fear doesn't live here." And with those words, the truth of it settled over the moment completely, undeniable and absolute. For a moment there was a frozen stillness on the porch, the kind of moment that feels stretched so thin it could snap with the smallest touch. The Prescotts were trapped between fury and fear, Mikhail holding Eleanor firmly in place, while Garrett scrambled awkwardly to push himself up from the wooden boards beneath him, his pride more battered than his body, but his eyes still full of a blind rage that refused to let him see the futility of what he was doing. His face was flushed deep red, veins bulging at his temples, jaw tight as he tried to swallow his humiliation and turn it back into aggression. Though anyone watching could see his bravado was wearing thin under the weight of reality. "You let me go," Eleanor hissed, twisting against Mikhail's steady grip, her voice sharp with a panic that she tried to disguise as anger. But it cracked beneath the surface, the strain bleeding through no matter how hard she fought to keep her composure. "Do you know who we are?" Mikhail's eyes, steady and cold, did not flicker once, as he held her wrist firm, not tight enough to hurt her, but tight enough to leave no doubt who controlled this moment. "I know exactly who you are," he answered, his voice even and low, his gaze sharp as a blade honed over years of quiet battle. "And it doesn't impress me." Garrett, now back on his feet, charged again without thinking, his movements sloppy with anger, his body lunging forward in a way that revealed he had never truly learned to fight, only to dominate with brute force and the assumption that no one would ever push back. But Mikhail had seen this kind of man before, too many times to count, and he sidestepped Garrett's charge with ease, pivoting smoothly and using his opponent's momentum to drive him straight into the porch railing, the wood creaking under the weight of the impact. "You think this is over?" Garrett barked, even as he staggered back, trying to catch his breath, spitting his words through gritted teeth like they might carry some weight now that his fists had failed him. "You're finished. You and your girls, all of you." Mikhail's reply was calm, stripped of all fury, because it needed none, only the clean, undeniable truth. "No," he said, stepping toward Garrett with the quiet power of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. "You are." Garrett threw another punch, wild and desperate, but Mikhail caught his arm once more, locking it tight in his grasp before twisting him around and slamming him down onto the porch floor, flat on his back. The breath was knocked from his lungs in a hard gasp that left him sputtering beneath Mikhail's shadow. Eleanor screamed, her panic no longer hidden as she tried to tear herself free, clawing at Mikhail's arm with shaking hands. But her movements were erratic, full of a fear that had finally risen to the surface now that she saw her husband laid low. Mikhail released her wrist, not because she had forced him to, but because he no longer needed to hold her. Her strength was gone, drained out of her in the blink of an eye as she stumbled back, her chest heaving with frantic breaths. The twins stood just inside the doorway, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them, their faces carved with a quiet focus, not fear. They watched their father handle the Prescotts, not with wild aggression, but with controlled precision. Every movement a lesson they had seen in practice, but now witnessed fully alive. A living example of the discipline he had spent their lives teaching them. "This is what they always do," Mikhail said, loud enough for both the Prescotts and his daughters to hear, his words steady and strong as he stepped over Garrett's groaning form. "They think they can walk into our space, into our lives, and break us with threats and violence. But they forget. We don't fold. We stand. Eleanor's eyes darted toward her husband, who lay struggling to breathe, and then back to Mikhail, her lips parting as though she meant to speak, to spit another threat or excuse, but no words came. Her breath stuttered in her chest, her rage swallowed whole by the weight of her own helplessness. "Call the police!" she shrieked at last, her voice cracking under the strain of her panic. "Call them!" "He attacked us." But even as she screamed the words, there was a hollowness to them, a shaky weakness that made it clear she no longer believed her own cries. "You came here?" Mikhail reminded her, never raising his voice, but letting each word settle like a stone, dropping into still water, rippling out until there was no escaping it. "You brought violence to my door, and now you'll live with what you brought." Garrett, still gasping on the porch floor, managed to lift himself onto one elbow, his eyes wild with disbelief as he stared up at Mikhail, seeing not just the man in front of him, but everything he had underestimated, everything he had failed to understand until this moment had stripped him of all his false power. Sirens, distant but growing louder, began to echo through the neighborhood, the approaching sound slicing through the heavy air like a blade. Neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the noise and the chaos, their faces etched with a mix of curiosity and quiet satisfaction, as if they too had grown tired of the Prescotts' arrogance, and now watched with silent approval as justice unfolded on the front porch of the Petrova home. Mikhail didn't move, didn't flinch at the sound of the sirens. He stood tall, unshaken, his daughters beside him, their eyes clear and proud as they watched the scene play out. Whatever the police would bring next, they were ready, because they had already won the battle that mattered most. This fight was never about the punches thrown or the bruises left behind. It was about standing firm when others expected them to fall, about showing the Prescotts, the school, and the entire town that their strength could not be taken, could not be broken, no matter how hard they were pushed. As the flashing lights rounded the corner and the first patrol car pulled into the driveway, Mikhail's voice broke the heavy silence one final time, carrying across the porch, across the yard, and into the memory of everyone who stood witness. "You came looking for a fight," he said, his tone unshakable, his presence as solid as the ground beneath him. "Now you've found it." The flashing blue and red lights washed over the front of the house, pulsing against the walls and windows in slow, steady waves, as though the storm that had thundered across their doorstep was not finished, but merely changing shape, trading fists and fury for the cold authority of uniforms and badges. Mikhail remained still at the center of it all, his daughters flanking him on either side, the three of them framed by the doorway like an unbroken line of defense against the chaos that had tried so hard to breach their home. The first officers stepped from their vehicles with practiced caution, their hands near their belts, their eyes sweeping over the scene as they read the details in silent calculation, the two bodies on the porch floor, disheveled and breathless, the man standing tall before them, composed and unwavering. The neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns, watching with tight expressions, some crossing their arms, some whispering to each other beneath the siren's fading echo. Eleanor Prescott's voice cut through the tension first, sharp and frantic, rising in volume as she rushed toward the officers, her arms waving as though she could pull them fully onto her side by sheer force of desperation. "Officer, arrest him!" she demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at Mikhail, her face flushed with anger and something deeper beneath it, fear, raw and poorly hidden behind her rage. "He attacked us. We were defending ourselves, and he assaulted us in our own community." Her words tumbled over each other in a rush, growing more breathless with each accusation. But the lead officer, a man whose badge read Klein, did not react with immediate acceptance. He held up a steady hand, his eyes scanning not just Eleanor, but the whole scene, reading it with the quiet experience of someone who had seen enough of life's messes to know that truth rarely lived on the surface. "Ma'am," Officer Klein said, keeping his tone measured and professional, "I need you to step back and take a breath. We're going to sort this out, but I need to hear from everyone, and I'll start by speaking to the homeowner." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, but something in Klein's steady gaze stopped her short. She let out a sharp breath, her chest rising and falling as she stepped back beside Garrett, who still lay groaning on the porch floor, holding his ribs with one arm as though the pain in his body could somehow lend more truth to his words when his turn came to speak. Officer Klein approached Mikhail next, his eyes cautious but not hostile, his tone neutral. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Mikhail met the officer's gaze directly, his posture steady, his voice calm and even as he spoke. "They came to my home uninvited," he explained, not rushing his words, letting each one settle with weight and clarity. "They came angry about an incident at the school involving our children. They confronted me on my porch, they shouted threats, and then he, Mikhail, motioned with a slight nod toward Garrett. Threw the first punch. I defended myself and my family. And your daughters?" Klein asked, his eyes flicking toward Lyra and Lena, who stood silent but strong beside their father. "They witnessed everything," Mikhail replied without hesitation, his tone firm. "They did not engage. They stayed inside just as I instructed them to." Klein gave a small nod, his gaze thoughtful, weighing Mikhail's words against the scene laid out before him. He turned next to Eleanor and Garrett, his notepad in hand, ready to hear their side, though it was clear from the quiet tightness of his expression that he had already begun to piece together the truth. Eleanor launched into her version of the story with the same breathless desperation she had shown earlier, weaving lies with practiced ease, painting herself and her husband as victims of an unprovoked assault, their words dripping with entitlement as they cast Mikhail in the role of aggressor. But her performance faltered beneath the steady gaze of Officer Klein, who made no move to interrupt, but whose eyes darkened with quiet skepticism the longer she spoke. "And you claim you were defending yourselves?" Klein asked once she finished, his tone carefully neutral but edged with the weight of doubt. "We came here to talk," Eleanor insisted, her voice rising again. But the cracks were clear now, her composure fraying at the edges as she struggled to maintain her narrative. "He attacked us." Klein's eyes narrowed slightly, and then, as if sensing that words alone were not enough to unravel the truth, he turned to the growing cluster of neighbors standing at the edges of their yards, some holding their phones, others speaking quietly among themselves. "I'm going to need witness statements," Klein called out, his voice carrying across the lawn with quiet authority. "Anyone who saw what happened, step forward." There was a long beat of silence, heavy and uncertain, and then slowly, as though spurred by a shared sense of justice that had waited too long for its moment, a neighbor stepped forward from across the street. An older man with a lined face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw the whole thing," he said, his voice firm. "They came here shouting from the moment they stepped out of their car." The man threw the first punch. The homeowner never moved until they forced his hand. Another neighbor followed, then another, their voices weaving together to form a clearer picture. A chorus of truth that cut through Eleanor's lies like sunlight through fog. Each account confirmed what Mikhail had already said, their words steady, their memories sharp. Klein listened to every word, his pen moving steadily across his notepad. And when the last neighbor had finished speaking, he closed the pad with a quiet snap that seemed to echo louder than the sirens had minutes before. "We're going to continue this at the station," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But based on what I've heard so far, it looks like we have more questions for you too." His eyes settled on Eleanor and Garrett, their faces pale and drawn beneath the harsh flash of police lights. Officers moved in to assist Garrett to his feet, cuffing him gently but firmly as Eleanor's protests rose again, thinner now, weaker, her voice trailing off into helplessness as the weight of reality pressed down hard and final. Mikhail stood unmoving as they were led away, his daughters at his side, his breath slow and steady, his gaze fixed not on the Prescotts, but on the horizon beyond them, where justice at long last was beginning to find its place. And though the night was far from over, though questions would still need answers and shadows would still need to be cleared away, there was no mistaking the shift that had begun. The tide was turning, and this time it was turning in their favor. The station, had the cold stillness of a place that saw too many lives pressed into its walls, too many voices raised in panic or protest, too many truths twisted beneath the weight of assumptions. Yet, as Mikhail and his daughters sat in the plain metal chairs of the waiting area, there was no fear in them, no tremor in their hands or in their breathing, only the quiet, measured patience of a family that had faced storms far greater than this, and knew that the only way through was to stand firm and let the truth rise. Slow and unstoppable, like the tide against the rocks, Officer Klein moved between desks and filing cabinets with the focus of a man who understood the shape of a lie the moment it passed his ears, who had seen too many scenes like the one now unfolding to mistake noise for truth. He worked methodically, gathering statements, reviewing the accounts of the neighbors who had already begun to fill out written testimonies, and checking the footage from nearby doorbell cameras that had been offered up without hesitation by residents eager to see justice done properly for once. Mikhail watched him quietly, his eyes following every step, not with suspicion, but with a cautious respect for the man's diligence. He saw in Klein not the quick judgment of a man eager to close a case, but the slow, steady patience of someone who knew that real answers came not from who shouted the loudest, but from who stood the longest on solid ground. Lyra and Lena sat close to their father, their posture upright, their faces calm, though inside both felt the slow churn of everything they had endured, everything they had carried, rising to the surface as the walls of the station seemed to close in and the long wait stretched further. Yet even through the quiet tension, they did not falter. They had faced worse storms and come through unbroken, and they knew they would come through this one the same way. Klein approached at last, his notepad tucked under one arm, his expression thoughtful, lined with the weight of what he had gathered. He paused before them, clearing his throat gently before speaking. "Mr. Petrova," he began, his voice careful but firm, "I've reviewed the neighbor statements and security footage, and it's clear you didn't start the confrontation. It's also clear your actions were defensive." Mikhail offered a small nod, acknowledging the officer's words without triumph, without relief, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who expected nothing less from the truth. Klein continued, shifting his weight slightly as he glanced at his notes. "What's more, the footage we've collected also shows that the Prescotts came to your property aggressively. They crossed onto your porch first, they raised their voices, and they initiated physical contact. Multiple angles confirm this." A soft breath passed between Lyra and Lena, not quite a sigh, but the slow release of held tension, a moment of quiet reassurance settling in their chests, like a small flame that refused to go out, no matter how much wind had battered it. "However," Klein went on, his tone still even, "given the severity of the injuries and the Prescotts' claims, we'll need to document everything fully. There will be formal statements, a full report, and there may still be legal proceedings. But I want you to know," he added, his gaze settling on Mikhail with something that felt almost like respect, "from what I've seen, the evidence is clearly in your favor." Mikhail's reply came without hesitation, his voice low and sure. "We'll give you every answer you need." As they followed Klein into the interview room, Lyra and Lena felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into their bones, not as a burden, but as a reminder of everything they had endured to reach this point. They sat beside their father, answering questions with clarity, recounting the events of the day with steady voices that carried the full truth of their experience, not leaving room for doubt or distortion. Piece by piece, the story unfolded under the watchful eyes of the officers, not as a twisted tale spun from fear and bias, but as a clean, unbroken chain of facts that led from the first shove in the courtyard to the final confrontation on their doorstep. They told of the days of harassment, of the cruel prank that had pushed them to the edge, of the fight forced upon them by boys who believed they could do anything without consequence. They spoke not as victims, but as survivors, and as their story filled the room, the shape of the truth became impossible to deny. Later, as they stepped out of the interview room to a quieter corner of the station, Mikhail turned to his daughters, his voice soft but carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "You see how it works," he said, not as a lesson, but as a reminder of what they already knew in their bones. "They'll twist the story, try to make it theirs. But the truth is patient. It waits, and when it's time, it stands tall." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes bright with resolve. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice firm. Lena nodded beside her, her expression just as steady. "But we're getting there." Klein approached again, a faint tightness in his jaw as he flipped open his notepad once more. "There's something else," he said, his tone cautious but not hesitant. "One of your neighbors mentioned something about earlier trouble at the school. We're going to pull surveillance footage from the school property as well. If there's a pattern, it'll help clear this up faster." At those words, a quiet ripple of understanding passed between Mikhail and his daughters. They had carried the weight of the bullying alone until now, had endured in silence, while the school turned a blind eye. But if the truth of those days could finally come to light, then this battle would not only clear their names, it would expose the rot that had festered beneath Crestwood Preparatory for far too long. "Do it," Mikhail said, without pause. "Let the whole story come out." Klein gave a small nod and stepped away to make the call, his movements efficient, his purpose clear. As the quiet of the station settled around them once more, the twins and their father sat together, steady and unshaken, knowing the storm had not fully passed, but also knowing the tide had turned irreversibly in their favor, and no matter what came next, they would be ready. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights filled the station with a low, steady buzz, a sound that might have been insignificant in any other moment. But here, under the weight of what was unfolding, it seemed to underline every passing second, stretching time as the final pieces of truth began to slide into place. Mikhail sat with his daughters close beside him, the three of them a steady line of resolve in a room that had grown tight with tension, the atmosphere thick with the scent of papers, ink, and the slow burn of justice that was beginning at last to catch fire. Across the room, through the narrow glass panels of the adjoining office, they could see Eleanor and Garrett Prescott seated at a separate table, their posture fraying under the pressure that was building around them. Eleanor's sharp features, once held together with the confidence of entitlement, had begun to crack, her eyes darting from one officer to another, her mouth pressed into a thin line as though she was trying to hold back the fear that trembled just beneath her surface. Garrett sat heavier in his chair, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of more than just physical pain, his gaze avoiding the window, avoiding Mikhail's eyes, avoiding the inevitable. Officer Klein returned to the room, a folder thick with printed photographs and reports tucked beneath his arm, his expression sharpened by the clarity that only undeniable evidence could provide. He moved with a sense of purpose that filled the space between them, pulling a chair closer to the table before he set the folder down and flipped it open, the first page catching the harsh light overhead. A still image pulled from a neighbor's security camera, showing Garrett Prescott mid-swing, his face twisted in anger, his fist flying toward Mikhail's head. Without a word, Klein spread the images across the table, each one more damning than the last, capturing the escalation frame by frame, the truth laid bare in a sequence of moments too clear to deny. There was no confusion in the photographs, no room left for twisting stories or fabricating excuses, only the plain, undeniable fact that the Prescotts had brought their fury to Mikhail's doorstep and ignited the confrontation with their own hands. Mikhail's gaze remained steady on the images, his face composed, his breath slow and even. Not because the evidence surprised him, but because it confirmed what he had known from the start, that the truth, though it may have been delayed, had never strayed from their side. "We've also pulled initial footage from the school's surveillance system," Klein continued, his voice firm as he laid out a second set of images, these darker and grainier but no less clear in their story. "The camera caught the prank at the lockers, the boys cornering your daughters in the hallway, the shove that led to the fight in the courtyard. Between these, the witness statements from your neighbors, and the admissions made by a few students after we followed up, we have a strong case building in your favor." At his words, a quiet breath passed between Lyra and Lena, not relief in the way of weakness, but in the form of a slow, patient exhale. as though they were allowing themselves, just for a moment, to feel the weight of the battle begin to lift from their shoulders. "And the Prescotts?" Mikhail asked, his voice low but steady, carrying the question not with desperation, but with the weight of responsibility, as a man who had never needed to shout to be heard. Klein's mouth tightened for a heartbeat before he answered, his words chosen carefully but leaving no room for doubt. "They're in deep," he replied, his tone edged with quiet finality. "They came here full of bluster, thinking their story would carry weight on its own. But with this evidence, their accusations are falling apart fast. The more they talk, the deeper they dig their own hole." As Klein spoke, movement caught Mikhail's eye beyond the glass. Another officer entered the room where Eleanor and Garrett sat, a thick stack of papers in hand, setting them down on the table with a thud that seemed to ripple through the very air between them. Eleanor's mouth moved, her words lost behind the glass, but her rising panic was plain to see, her gestures sharp and frantic as she tried to argue against the growing mountain of facts. Garrett, for all his earlier rage, sat silent now, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his hands clasped tightly together as though he could hold back the consequences by sheer force of will. "Let them see it all," Mikhail said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, though Klein heard him clearly and gave a small nod of agreement. "Let them see what happens when they push too far." "We intend to," Klein replied, closing the folder with a deliberate motion, as if sealing the fate of the Prescotts between its pages. Moments later, they were joined by another officer, this one younger, his uniform freshly pressed, but his expression already hardened by the realities of the job. He carried a printed transcript in his hands, placing it before Klein with a subtle nod. "Statements from 2 of the students," the officer explained, his voice steady. "They confirm prior harassment at the school, consistent with what Mr. Petrova and his daughters reported." Klein scanned the pages quickly, his eyes sharpening with every line he read. "That should be enough," he said at last, setting the papers down with a quiet weight that seemed to settle not just on the table, but in the air around them. "We'll be moving forward with charges. Assault, trespassing, possibly harassment, once the full scope at the school is established." Mikhail gave no outward reaction, his calm undisturbed. But Lyra and Lena felt the subtle shift in their father's posture, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had stood his ground, not for the sake of victory alone, but for justice itself. Eleanor's voice, sharp even behind the glass, rose once more, a desperate sound, with none of its earlier confidence. Greg's shoulders sagged further, his head lowering as if he could no longer bear the weight of the truth pressing down upon him from every side. Officer Klein turned back to Mikhail and his daughters, his expression settling into something almost respectful. "You've handled yourselves well," he said simply. "This won't be easy, and it's not finished yet, but you did the right thing." Mikhail inclined his head once, a gesture of acknowledgment rather than gratitude, for he had never fought for approval, only for what was right. As the officers moved to process the Prescotts, leading them from the interview room with firm, unyielding steps, the Petrova family remained seated, their eyes steady, their hearts aligned in quiet unity. The tide had not just turned, it had begun to sweep away the lies, exposing the truth beneath. And though the fight had yet to reach its final conclusion, they could see the end on the horizon, as sure and steady as the rising sun. And when that moment came, they would meet it together. The station held its breath beneath the weight of everything that had come to light, as if the very walls, the air itself, had grown heavy with the truth finally forced into the open. Too real and too solid to be denied or reshaped by the hands of those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Mikhail, seated between his daughters, remained unmoving, his gaze steady as he watched the officers carry out their work, their motions no longer hurried or uncertain, but deliberate, shaped by the clarity of evidence that had built, brick by brick, into an unbreakable wall around the Prescotts' crumbling defense. Across the room, through the narrow strip of glass that separated the main floor from the smaller holding area, Eleanor paced like a caged animal, her hands twisting in tight fists at her sides, her eyes wild as they searched for something, some gap in the wall, some thread to pull loose that might unravel the case closing fast around her. But there was nothing left for her to grasp. No more lies to spin that hadn't already tangled into knots too tight to escape. Garrett, once loud and certain, now sat slumped in his chair, his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his head bowed low beneath the weight of failure. His eyes, dull and lost, stared at the floor as though the answers he sought might appear there, if only he stared hard enough. But he found nothing except the hollow echo of his own choices staring back at him. Officer Klein stood at the center of it all, his posture firm, his expression sharpened by the finality of the moment. He flipped through the last of the statements and recordings gathered in the hours since the Prescotts had been brought in, his mind running through the full story laid bare before him. Neighbors' testimonies, clear and consistent, camera footage from multiple angles painting an undeniable picture, student witnesses at the school filling in every gap that might have been left behind. He turned to Mikhail, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured to reach this point. "We've completed our preliminary findings," Klein began, his tone steady and without hesitation. "The charges against you and your daughters will be dropped immediately. The evidence leaves no room for any other decision." Lyra and Lena shared a glance, a silent moment of understanding passing between them, not of surprise. For they had always known their truth would prevail, but of quiet vindication, the kind that does not shout in triumph but settles deep in the chest, steady and certain. Mikhail inclined his head slightly, his composure unshaken, though behind his calm exterior there was the faintest shift, a release of the tension he had carried for his daughters, for his family. Every moment of this battle weighing on him more heavily than he would ever let show. "And the Prescotts?" Mikhail asked, not because he needed the answer, but because it mattered that the words were spoken plainly, out loud for all to hear. Klein's gaze hardened as he responded. "They will face charges," he confirmed, unfolding each count with quiet precision, as though placing stones on a scale. "Assault, harassment, trespassing, and obstruction. Their actions at the school and here at your home are well documented. They won't be talking their way out of this." As if to underline the statement, another officer stepped into the holding area, unlocking the door with a sharp twist of the key and motioning to Eleanor and Garrett to rise. Eleanor's protests, sharp and rising in panic, fell flat against the steady commands of the officers, her words reduced to noise beneath the full weight of the law that now pressed down upon her. "You have no right," she cried, her voice cracking beneath the strain. But the officer guiding her offered no response, only the silent firmness of duty done without bias. Garrett, drained of fight, rose slowly, his shoulders slumped as the cuffs clicked into place around his wrists, his gaze flicking to Mikhail for just a breath of a moment before falling away, unable to hold the eyes of the man he had underestimated so badly. The twins watched in silence, not gloating, not cheering, but with a deep, quiet satisfaction that grew from knowing they had stood firm against the storm and refused to be broken. They had answered hate not with fear but with courage. They had answered violence not with surrender, but with a strength that came from years of discipline and from the unshakable bond they shared with their father and with each other. As the Prescotts were led from the room, their departure heavy with finality, Officer Klein turned back to the family with a softer edge to his voice. "You've done well," he said, pausing as though weighing his words before adding, "You held your ground with honor. That matters more than you know." Mikhail gave no answer, needing none. His steady gaze followed the Prescotts until they disappeared through the exit, swallowed by the system they had thought would protect them, but which had instead revealed their true nature to the world. The station began to settle after that, the frantic energy of the day cooling into a calmer rhythm, as officers filed reports and finalized the necessary paperwork. Klein assured Mikhail that the official exoneration documents would follow within the hour, and that the school, too, would be notified of the findings, though Mikhail already knew that battle was one he would gladly see through to the end. Lyra and Lena, though weary from the long hours of questioning and waiting, sat poised and unbowed, their eyes sharp, their shoulders squared as they prepared to leave the station behind. knowing full well that while this chapter had closed, the lessons they had carved into their spirits would never fade. As the three of them stood together, their silhouettes framed against the dimming light filtering through the station's windows, there was a quiet power in their unity, an unspoken promise that no matter what came next, they would meet it not as victims of someone else's story, but as the authors of their own. They had fought, they had endured, and they had won. The morning sun stretched across the front of Crestwood Preparatory Academy, casting long beams of light over the familiar paths and polished brick buildings. But today, the light seemed sharper, clearer, as though the air itself had been washed clean after a long, bitter storm. The courtyard, once the stage for silent stares and loud, cruel whispers, now held a different kind of weight, not heavy with menace, but filled with the quiet buzz of change, the kind that moves through a place not in loud shouts, but in the restless, nervous energy of those who know the ground beneath their feet has shifted. Word had spread faster than anyone could have expected, carried not by rumor, but by the undeniable facts that had emerged in the wake of the Prescott's arrest and the damning evidence laid bare for all to see. Students who had once laughed along with Corbin and his friends now gathered in cautious clusters, their voices lower, their eyes more careful as they glanced toward the entrance where the twins were expected to return. Teachers who had turned away from the harassment, who had chosen silence over intervention, now carried a stiffness in their movements, a quiet shame etched into their faces as they prepared for the inevitable reckoning. Inside the administrative office, Headmaster Albright stood with his shoulders drawn tight beneath the weight of everything that had come crashing down upon his institution. He held in his hands the official reports delivered by the police department, reports that left no room for doubt or delay. His gaze drifted over the names listed beneath the bold, clear charges: Corbin Prescott, Finn Carter, Liam Shaw, and beside them the final inescapable recommendation: expulsion, effective immediately. Across from him sat Mikhail Petrova, calm and composed, his posture as steady as it had been in the station, his eyes unwavering as they met the headmaster's with quiet authority. Beside him, Lyra and Lena sat poised, their uniforms crisp, their faces set with the strength of those who had weathered the storm and emerged not just standing, but unbowed. "The board met early this morning," Albright began, his voice carrying the tightness of a man forced to confront his own failures. "In light of the investigation's findings and the overwhelming evidence of harassment and assault against your daughters, the suspension has been rescinded, effective immediately. They will return to their classes today." He paused, clearing his throat as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tightening over the edge of the papers. "Furthermore, the students responsible for the harassment and the attack have been expelled permanently." There was a beat of silence, not because it was needed, but because it felt right to let the words hang in the air, to let them settle fully before moving forward. Mikhail's voice, when he spoke, carried no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only the deep, unwavering calm of a father who had fought for justice and now saw it delivered. "It's the decision that should have been made from the start," he said plainly, not as an accusation, but as an undeniable truth. Albright's lips tightened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. Whether it was regret or embarrassment or both, it was impossible to say. But he nodded, the gesture small but telling. "We failed your family," he admitted, his voice lower now, roughened by the weight of the truth. "We failed our duty to protect all our students. That will change." Lyra's gaze held the headmaster's with the same clear steadiness that had carried her through every cruel word, every shove, every attempt to make her and her sister feel less than they were. "See that it does," she said, her words measured but firm, leaving no room for false promises. Beside her, Lena's voice followed with equal strength. "Not just for us," she added, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "For every student who doesn't fit your mold." For a moment, Albright seemed to falter beneath the weight of their words, but then he gave a shallow nod, the papers trembling slightly in his grasp as he finally set them aside. As they rose from their chairs, Mikhail placed a hand lightly on each of his daughter's shoulders, a quiet gesture of pride, that needed no words to carry its meaning. Together they stepped out of the office and into the main hallway, their footsteps echoing through the marble corridor that had once felt like a gauntlet but now felt more like a path cleared by their courage and determination. Students turned to watch them, some with open curiosity, others with quiet respect, and a few with lingering shame etched into their expressions as they recalled the roles they had played, whether through action or silence. But none dared speak. None dared mock or sneer. The weight of what had unfolded had left them no cover, no comfortable shadow to hide within. The twins walked side by side, their heads high, their shoulders straight, not as returning victims, but as champions of their own story, as proof that resilience in the face of cruelty can shatter even the strongest walls of prejudice. Outside the building, the morning breeze brushed against their faces, cool and clean, as if the very air recognized the shift that had come at last. Their father stepped alongside them, his presence as steady as ever. And together they crossed the courtyard, not with haste, but with the deliberate, confident pace of those who had earned every step forward. And as they moved, Mikhail's voice, low and sure, broke the quiet between them. "The storm is over," he said, not as a wish, but as a fact, as certain and unshakable as the sun rising over the horizon. "No," Lyra answered, her eyes on the path ahead, her tone carrying the quiet strength that had carried her through the fire. "We ended it." Lena's lips curved into the smallest, fiercest smile, her eyes bright beneath the morning light. "And we'll end it again," she added, "whenever it comes." Together they crossed the threshold of the school, leaving behind the shadows of doubt and stepping fully into the light of justice, finally done. And though the road ahead would always carry challenges, they knew with absolute certainty that whatever storms came next, they would meet them as they had met this one, together, unbroken and unafraid. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so natural it almost felt as though the storm had never touched them, as if the winds of cruelty that had once blown so hard against their backs had at last quieted into nothing more than a distant memory. Yet Lyra and Lena never forgot. They did not carry the weight of what had happened as a burden, but as something far sharper and far stronger, a reminder of their own strength, woven into every step they took across the familiar paths of Crestwood Preparatory Academy. The school itself seemed changed in subtle ways, as though it had learned to breathe differently, the air no longer thick with the unspoken permission of cruelty. Teachers, once tight-lipped and quick to avert their eyes, now greeted the twins with a respect that felt earned rather than forced. They called their names in class not with indifference, but with genuine regard, their voices steady, their eyes meeting theirs without the old hesitation. Their classmates, too, had shed the shadows they had once worn so easily. No longer did the corridors echo with mocking laughter or sharp whispers. Instead, there were nods of acknowledgment, small but real, and quiet moments where silence felt like respect rather than avoidance. In the courtyard, where once they had walked beneath the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, Lyra and Lena now moved freely, their heads high, their steps unhurried. They sat beneath the old oak tree during lunch, sunlight warming their faces as they talked about everything and nothing at all, their voices light with the ease of those who no longer had to watch every word, every glance, every breath. It was not perfection because they had never sought that. What they had now was something far better, peace, built not on fear but on strength earned through fire. They knew that the battle they had fought had not only freed them, but had shifted something permanent in the very bones of the school itself, a quiet but unbreakable change that would endure long after the memory of the Prescotts faded. Their father's words stayed with them, not as distant echoes, but as living truths carried close to their hearts. "Stand your ground," he had told them time and again. And they had done exactly that, not just for themselves, but for every student who walked those same halls now and would walk them in the future. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the green lawn, the twins sat side by side, their laughter rising easy and unforced, their eyes bright with the simple joy of a day well lived. They had not just survived Crestwood Preparatory Academy. They had claimed it, and as they looked out over the grounds at the place that had once tried to shrink them into silence, they saw only the wide-open horizon of the life they had built with their own hands, their own courage, their own unshakable bond. They had won, and they would keep on winning every single day. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.